When I was in college, I worked for a local hospital, one of the largest in North Georgia outside of Atlanta. I won't name drop because they probably don't want to be mentioned, but this hospital was huge. I'd worked clerical jobs in a few other hospitals, but you could have easily fit 3 of my previous facilities in this place. That being said, it was a mismatched monstrosity of old and new. The new medical promenade might have been a modern architectural marvel, but areas like the ER and the admin hallway still looked much as they had in the 1970s. It's a place at war with itself, constantly changing, but also constantly staying the same. That's probably why there are so many ghost stories connected to this place. Working at the ER desk, I came in for a lot of rumors, especially since I worked the night shift. Security has an office in the ER, since it's where the biggest train wrecks usually happen. That means that Carl, the night watchman, would usually wander over to hang out and watch YouTube videos when I'm not checking people in. David, the late night maintenance guy, and Mark, the 11 to 7 switchboard operator, were also pretty likely to come hang out if the night was slow or they were on break. Between the 3 of them, I've heard all the good stories from after hours. Some of them were kind of funny, like the nurses Carl walked in on screwing during a security check, or the handsome ER surgeon, Dr. Logan, who cried to Mark for 3 hours while he was stuck in the elevator that wouldn't work. These stories were fun, but they inevitably led to stories about the hospital's haunted areas and the weird occurrences they sometimes witness. Some of them were clearly bullshit, like David telling me that his ladder had disappeared from the 4th floor stairwell and appeared on the roof. But some of them were too weird to be pure fabrication. Certain areas of the hospital were definitely more active than others. Places like the South Promenade, where a girl had jumped to her death from the 4th floor railing. David claimed to this day that he watched a shadowy figure drop to the tiles a few times, and the look on his face makes me believe that he probably wasn't lying. Then there's the matter of Mark's phantom phone calls every night. Mark claims that he gets at least 4 phone calls from the courtesy phone on the 3rd floor, between midnight and 4 a.m. The caller never says anything, but Mark was sure he could hear a little whisper under all the static. One night he had recorded the noises on his cell phone and let a friend listen to them who's into paranormal stuff. When his friend had processed it through a computer program, the caller had said things like Jackie and love and baby, but the rest had been nothing but gibberish. It happened at the same time in the wee hours every morning, and Mark had even sent Carl up to the phone on a few occasions to check for people playing jokes on him. Carl had reported that the phone wasn't even plugged in, yet the phone calls still came. Then, of course, there was Shaky Leg Mary. Many members of the hospital staff had seen the entity known as Shaky Leg Mary. She had been seen in the ambulance bay, in the ER, in the pass-through hallways where she was wheeled into surgery, but more often, she was seen wandering the OR hallways after hours. She had been a homeless woman that had been run over in front of Mary of Mercy one night, before I was even hired. Her skull had been crushed, her lungs mostly collapsed, and her left leg had been a tangled mess of bones and flesh. They had rushed her to the ER as quickly as they could, but she had died on the table as they tried to operate on her. She had made frequent appearances after that, though. So when Carl came staggering up an hour ago, looking starey and pale, I knew he had seen something. I figured he'd had another situation with a combative patient, but it turned out to be a little worse than that. I just saw her," he whispered, like he was afraid to say it out loud. I looked up from my YouTube video and clicked pause after I'd had a look at him. "Saw who?" I asked. "Mary. Shaky Leg Mary," he said. "I saw her in the surgical hallway." I told him to tell me the story, and he shakingly obliged. Carl had been doing his rounds as he usually did when he saw her. He had come through the surgical center, checking doors and making sure everything was secured. It was 3 a.m., and he was making his way briskly about his appointed rounds so he could stop by the cafeteria and get a cup of coffee before he headed upstairs to continue. All he had to do was cut through the surgical OR hallway, check the operating room doors, and he'd come out next to the cafeteria. He had opened the door, and that's when he'd seen her. She'd been standing in the hallway, her back to Carl, and he had pulled out his flashlight to shine it at her. He was just about to yell at her, tell her that this was a restricted area, and that's when he had finally noticed her leg. It was twisted up like a bent signpost, and he watched as it flexed weirdly beneath her. Her hair was dark and oozed with something pink and viscous. Carl swore he could hear her breathing raggedly, her air hitching in oddly as her deflated lungs tried to pump it, and the bulb popped when he dropped his flashlight. The sound made her turn, and her squashed face looked like a ruined jack-o'-lantern as the bulbous eyes stared blindly in his direction. She was as far from me as that water fountain, he said, pointing to a fountain that was about 30 feet away, but that leg didn't stop her from coming after me. Carl said she hunkered, going on all fours like a dog, and charged him grotesquely. Carl backpedaled, trying to run, but had tripped over his feet and fallen onto his rump at the least opportune time. She was gasping and closing in on him, jaws opening weirdly and a mouth that was mostly broken, when Carl thought to close the door between the two of them. He kicked out shakily and slammed the heavy door shut just as she was about to jump at him. She hit it like a cannonball and then screamed like an angry wildcat. As he sprawled there, panting, in the lighted hallway, he heard her slamming into the door 6 or 7 times before he found his feet and ran to somewhere where he knew there would be people. That's what had brought him to me. Carl later got David to agree to go with him to make sure it wasn't just some homeless person who had wandered in and was trashing the place. The two of them turned on all the lights and explored every OR room and the storage closets, but they didn't find anything but surgical equipment and cobwebs. She had disappeared as quickly as she had arrived, but they did bring me to that door to show me that she had left something behind before I left for the night. David showed me a heavy indent on the OR side of the door that had left a deep mark in the metal there. The door's a little bent too, he added. I'm sure I can fix the track on it before the week is out, though he was emphatic about the fact that he wouldn't fix it after dark. Carl never went into the OR hallway again after hours, and the legend of Shaky Leg Mary continued to grow. I work in a hospital call center. It's not great work, but it pays the bills. Though you may not think it, you get a lot of calls during the 8-hour shift you work. Usually it's just people trying to find a relative who might be in there, someone trying to schedule an appointment and surgery, maybe even someone seeking medical advice. I'm apparently not qualified to do any of those things, so the job became a lot of telling people, "1 moment please while I transfer you." Then you send them off to their desired department, or not, and you get to talk to them again, except less polite this time. You get a lot of angry people too, most looking for billing, or maybe because they got charged for a hospital service they didn't receive. Those people are best sent off as quickly as possible, before they can get a good head of steam going. There are 4 to 6 of us in the department at any given time. It's mostly college kids trying to pay their bills, or older people looking for a little extra on top of their social security. All in all, I think around 10 of us work the switchboard. And you get to know your coworkers pretty well, especially when there's so few of you. We also take turns working the midnight shift, most of us working the day or the mid shift primarily, and at the end of the month, we all walk away with a nice chunk of overtime for our troubles. People being people, there's always 12 or 16 hours of overtime a month. No one minds much, the job's pretty easy, and I liked having a job where I could finish my schoolwork or play on my phone for 8 to 16 hours and still get paid. That was before the heavy breather. Not a week went by where he didn't get at least one notation in the logbook. The notations were supposed to be for strange or unusual calls. For the last few months, most of the entries have been a heavy breather. We had named the caller because their calls were all pretty much the same. You'd pick up the phone and hear the telltale heavy breathing on the other end and know what was going on. We all just figured it was some pervert, some lonely sicko trying to get his rocks off to someone on the other end. You'd hang up before he could get his satisfaction and make a note of it in the logbook. I say these things like they were regular occurrences, but in truth I had yet to get the mystery caller. Every other operator had gotten him at least twice, some of them 3 or 4 times, but I had never managed to see what all the fuss was about. I would get my wish a couple of days later, though. 3 days of midnights? My boss just shrugged at me as she sank the push pin into the bulletin board. She posted our schedules by hand every week, despite the rest of the hospital having access to an electronic payroll system which generated the schedule for them. Martha is old school, though. Probably since she's been here since they pulled her out of the foundation when they broke ground. She's one of the best bosses I've ever had, too. She doesn't like how short-handed we are any more than we do. Sorry, kid. Roger says he's taking the weekend off to go visit his boyfriend. He's always doing this on such short notice. I swear I'd have fired him on the spot if we weren't so short-handed. Still, all 3 nights? You're the only one with an open schedule, kid. I'll give you next weekend off if you want it. Scout's honor. Martha made the promise so freely that I took her up on it in a heartbeat. A promise from Martha was worth its weight in gold. She couldn't possibly have known that this would likely be the last weekend I'd ever sit behind that desk. Friday night went pretty normally. I arrived at 11 p.m., brewed a thermos of coffee, and got to my desk around 11:15. Jordan and Aiden were there, finishing up their calls and cleaning up their stations as they waited for midnight. We chatted a little as I logged on, discussing call volume and talking about tonight's call-in schedule. Apparently, there was a team I needed to call in at 4 a.m. for a 5 a.m. case, and they added that the heavy breather had been calling a lot today. They don't say anything, they just keep calling about once an hour, like they're looking for someone. Pam swears she heard them say a name before they hung up, but Pam likes to make stuff up for attention. I got a little excited when Jordan told me that. If they were calling more often, then maybe I'd get to talk to them. I know it's weird to hope that a crazy person will call up and breathe on the phone, but I really wanted to experience it. I felt like it would make me like everyone else, and I was a little sore that I hadn't gotten him yet. I would get my wish about an hour later. It was about 12:30 when they called. I was sitting in the call center basement, sipping coffee and checking Reddit on my phone, when I heard the computer chirp and inform me that I had a call. It was from an unlisted number, not that uncommon, so I picked it up without thinking much about it. When I picked it up, it sounded like someone was sitting too close to a fan. The blowing was annoying, but I was a professional, and I tried to power through it. Southwest Medical Center, how may I help you? The noise on the other end sounded different slightly. I realized all at once that it was rain coming down hard on a window somewhere. Was it raining outside? It hadn't been when I came in. There hadn't been a cloud in the sky, actually. The rain covered it slightly, but as I sat in silence, I began to hear the deep breathing on the other end. There he was. There was the weird caller. Hello, Southwest Medical, can I help you? The breathing persisted, overtopped by the rain that hit hard on the window of wherever they were. I reached for the book to start scribbling down the usual message when I heard something over the phone. I heard a voice. Sorry? I asked, taken aback a little. It's always dark here. The pen fell out of my hand. No one had ever heard this person talk. It was always just heavy breathing for a couple of minutes before they hung up. Had they been waiting for something? I wondered for a moment if they'd talked before and maybe no one had told me. Was I the first one they'd ever talked to? It's always dark here, they repeated, and this time I stopped thinking and started listening. Where are you? I asked, not sure what else to say. The rain is so loud tonight. The voice was neither male or female and sounded low and growly, like someone getting over a cold. Look, I'm not sure who you are, but you've called a hospital. If you need some help, I'll be happy to help you, but otherwise, I need to... Cherish says hi, the voice whispered. That made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had a sister named Cherish. She was about 12, and as far as I knew, she was asleep at my parents' house. I shook off my fear and began to become a little angry. Whoever this was, they were obviously having a laugh on my account, and it really wasn't funny. Who is this? Roger, is this you? I swear to God, I'm going to HR if this is you. This isn't even a little bit funny. You need to stop. That's when the line went dead. I held the phone against my ear for a few more seconds before putting it in the cradle and looking around nervously. I expected Roger or maybe Jordan to pop out of the break room with their cell phone, laughing because they'd spooked me. All the company I got, though, was the sound of the air conditioner cycling overhead. I sat for a few more minutes, drumming my fingers, trying to forget the call. The more I thought about it, the weirder it got, though. My coworkers would have called back to make fun of me if this was a prank. If it wasn't them, then some stranger on the phone had called up and said my sister's name. Coincidence or not, I needed to be sure. My mom picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear Dad grumbling in the background. Hello? Mom, Hey, sorry, is Cherish okay? I know that's a weird question, but I could hear her sitting up in bed. Are you okay? You sound upset. Just please, answer me, Mom. Is Cherish okay? I don't know, hun. She's at sleepaway camp this week. My blood ran cold. I need you to call down there and make sure she's okay. What's all this about? She said groggily. I got a weird phone call a minute ago, and now I have to make sure she's okay. My phone rang and I looked at the number. Unknown name, unknown number. It couldn't be them again. Mom, I need to call you back. Just promise me that you'll call the camp and make sure she's okay. Mom said she would, and I hung up and picked up the incoming call. I was immediately bombarded by the sound of rain on glass and muffled heavy breathing. The caller's voice sounded watery, slurry, like they'd recently choked on some water. They sounded like someone with a sore throat or a bad case of pneumonia. Like a drowned person. Hello? Hello? Who is this? Cherish needs your help. I gritted my teeth and tried not to scream into the phone. Whoever this is, you need to stop. I'm not amused. You're not funny. I want you to... He's gone to get her. She thinks he's her friend, but he isn't. He wants to hurt her. You have to stop him. Who's gone to get her? The woodsman. He's a bad man. He wants your sister. I didn't have the slightest idea who this person was talking about, but whatever their game was, I was starting to get freaked out. Look, this isn't funny. If this is a joke or something, it's really gone to... The line went dead then, and I was left with static. I spent the next hour in a fitful state. I didn't want to call Mom back and bother her with this, but what if whoever that was wasn't kidding around? Surely my sister wasn't stupid enough to just go off with someone into the woods, right? I didn't know, and that lack of knowledge made me nervous. I began to feel the walls of the basement closing in on me, and the claustrophobic feeling made me shake. When the phone rang again, I caught it on the first ring without even really looking. Hello? I could hear the quaver in my voice. The rain was softer now, but the voice was no less intrusive. He has her! It all but screamed at me, and I thought I could hear someone in the background crying and screaming just under that husky rasp. He's hurting her! Please, hurry! Where are you? I screamed at them, leaning forward as though I could fall into the computer screen. Where has he taken her? If this was a prank, I was buying it hook, line, and sinker. I could hear someone, a small girl it sounded like, screaming and crying as someone did God knew what to her. My cell phone roared to life. I looked down to see it was Mom and picked it up without thinking. Mom was hysterical on the other end. She and Dad were in the car, driving up to the camp. The counselors had gone to check on Cherish and found her bed empty. What's more, they found muddy boot tracks going into her cabin and then leaving out the other way. They can't seem to track them. The rain here, it's been torrential. The state police are bringing in the tracking dogs, and they're going to start as soon as they can. She's in the woods, Mom. Someone has her, I sputtered out, still hearing the screams on the phone. Mom was silent for a few breaths. How do you know that? I've got a caller on the phone who says she's alive, but it sounds like he's hurting her. They're in the woods, Mom. Tell them to search the woods. She hung up on me, and when I picked up the phone, it had gone dead again. I sat in the silence and felt utterly impotent. Should I leave and go help them look? My job wasn't really the thing holding me there. I was sure people would understand if I abandoned my post, but I was hoping that the mystery caller would give me more information. Every second counted now. If my information would help them find my sister a little quicker, then all the better. I muddled through a few late-night calls while I waited, and I'm sure the people on the other end could tell I was tense. After an hour, Mom called to let me know that they'd arrived at the camp. The rain had made it very difficult for the dogs to find a trail, but they'd started searching the woods anyway. The police were confident they could locate her, but Mom wasn't so sure. She sounded scared and tired and just plain defeated. When she hung up, I stared at the phone on my desk and willed the mystery caller to call again. They'd been so chatty before. Why had they gone silent now? I pulled up call logs on my computer then and started trying to find the number. No name, no number was all I ever got. I know in movies the police can easily decode these private numbers, but I work for a hospital and not even the emergency part of the hospital. My resources were limited to what I could do on my out-of-date computer. When the phone rang 20 minutes later, I looked at the number and almost knocked it off the desk in my haste. No name, no number. Hello? Hello? Where are you? I need you to... He's killing her! He's trying to make it last, but he's killing her! The voice whispered harshly. Where are you? The police are looking for her, but I need to know where you are. The voice was silent for a moment, and I thought I'd lost them again. On the other end, I could hear whimpers, and the person making those noises sounded broken. Hot tears ran down my face as I listened to what could be my sister's final moments. I began to beg the voice to tell me where they were. I lay my hands against the desk and cried, letting the tears flow as the voice seemed to contemplate how to answer me. When I played here, it was about a mile from the camp, over a creek, past the blackberry fields, and up a little hill. His house is at the top of that hill. I've been here for so long, though. I don't know if any of those things are still here. Please hurry. She doesn't have much longer. Then the line went dead. I called my mom and gave her the information. When she relayed it to the counselor, they knew exactly where she was talking about. The house belonged to the groundskeeper, and he had lived there for quite a long time. She said the police were on their way now to check it out, and she asked me to thank the person on the phone if they called back. I waited for an hour, another long and agonizing hour, and when my cell phone rang, the number made my skin crawl. Unknown name, unknown caller. Were they calling my cell phone this time? That seemed unlikely, and when I picked it up, I was greeted not by the raspy voice of the sick child, but by the stony voice of Officer Darraway from the state police. He told me they'd found Cherish and the groundskeeper in his cabin. She ain't in a good way. The bastard used the time he had to do some pretty upsetting things. She's alive, and we're sending her on the next flight to the nearest hospital. That's the one you work at, I believe. I thanked him and told him to tell my parents that I'd be waiting for her when she got here. Your mama tells me you've been in contact with another child, and they gave you directions to find your sister. Yes, she just called me out of the blue. I don't even know how she got my number. He was silent for a moment. You'll forgive me for saying so, but that seems highly unlikely. How do you mean? I said, startled. The groundskeeper didn't have a phone in his cabin. His cell phone was on his person when we recovered him, and there's no other child in that cabin. That's impossible. They said they'd been there for a very long time. They've been calling for weeks. Look, I appreciate you helping us find your sister, but this whole story seems very far-fetched. That being said, I don't think we'd have found your sister without your help. I want to take a statement from you when I get there, but just know we don't consider you in any way connected to this, despite the oddness of your claim. I thanked him, and he thanked me before hanging up. I was getting ready to call Marta, the 6 a.m. person, so she could come in a little early to relieve me, when a familiar caller popped up on my screen. No name, no number. I picked it up as I prepared to thank the caller for their help. I had just started thanking them when I heard the heavy breathing on the other end, and stopped. The sound was completely different. The caller had a husky tone to his breath, and you could clearly hear their breathing jagged up and down as they went about whatever they were doing. This was no child's breathing. This was an adult, and I hung up the call before I could think too much about it. I sat there in a daze as I pulled the call log towards me. I logged the heavy breather, but thought for a moment about recording the other caller too. They had saved my sister's life, whoever they had been, and I decided not to add them to the log. I called Marta and told her what had happened. She agreed to come in for me and said she'd see me soon before hanging up. I'm sitting with my sister in the ICU as I write this, but I can't help but wonder who that mysterious caller was. How did they call me? How did they know where to find me? My sister is heavily sedated right now, but I'm a little afraid of what she might tell me when she comes to. Does she know the girl who called me? Did she tell her how to contact me? I'm afraid to go back to work now. I'm afraid of who else might call me when I again man that desk. What other lost souls might be just a phone call away. When David came stumbling towards the desk at about 5:30 one morning, he looked like a man who'd just come back from war. I picked up the phone and called Carl immediately, telling him to get here on the run. I wouldn't usually call security for someone I knew just wandering up. Still, despite David looking like he'd seen a ghost, there was another very crucial reason I notified Carl of the terrified-looking maintenance man who had just staggered up and leaned against my desk. Carl would want to know, especially after what had been going on for the last 3 days. David had been missing after failing to clock out one morning. When Carl had come in the next night and told me that David was missing, I immediately felt bad about how I'd treated him the last time we'd spoken. David had been losing things lately. Last week alone, he'd lost 2 wrenches, a drywall saw, a tool bag, and an 8-foot ladder. The ladder seemed to almost offend him, and he complained bitterly about it for several days. He had also started talking about that damn stairwell again, the one he claimed made things disappear sometimes. They always appeared on the roof again, or so he said, and he went on and on about it until I just couldn't take it anymore. One early morning, after a night of checking in complainers and listening to whiners, I finally told him that it was probably under the stairs somewhere and he should probably go look for it instead of bothering me. He walked off in a huff, and I didn't see him again until he staggered up to my desk just before quitting time. As Carl ran up, puffing like a bellows, I heard David whisper, "It was the stairs. I climbed and climbed, but they just never ended." I waited with him until the stretcher rolled away, and he groaned as they trundled him past the stairwell and into the ER. I learned through the grapevine that he had been suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. They said it looked like he'd been walking for days, and his feet were covered in blisters. Management kept him isolated for the first 5 days, and I tried to visit him every day. On the 6th day, they finally let me in, and I heard how he had spent the last 3 days on the stairs. He was watching TV when I arrived, and my first act was to apologize for being so short with him. "It's nothing," David assured me. "I let all the loss go to my mouth. Turns out, I should have just let it go," David said, getting a faraway look about him. Even after 5 days of rest, David still looked haggard. "It would have saved me being stuck on that damn stairwell for 3 days. I didn't ask for an explanation. The man had been through enough. It was true that I wanted to hear the story of his disappearance, but after that look, I couldn't bring myself to pry. That look was the same I'd seen on men that had been through natural disasters. Turned out, I didn't have to ask, though. David wanted to talk about it. "I had gone to check the stairwell, see if maybe I'd left it on the upper landing," he said, stuttering as he recalled the events. When the door slammed shut behind me, I knew something didn't sound right." He was trying to keep a smile on his face, but it looked ghastly for the effort. "But I went up the stairs anyway, never knowing what I was getting into." The door had slammed with a note of finality, and David had felt himself shudder as it rang out behind him. David hadn't been that scared in a long time, but he'd be damned if he could say why. He'd felt, for a moment, like a goose had walked over his grave, and he wanted nothing so much as to run back to the door and push it open again. Instead, he mounted the stairs and climbed the 30 steps to the first landing. David had made this trip 1,000 times, and it seemed comfortable to hear his boots clump, clump, clump up the polished concrete steps. He knew all of them, all 150 stairs over the 5 floors of the hospital, and he would have said that there was nothing new or strange about them. He made it to the second landing and looked around as though he expected the missing items to have materialized from nothing. He still saw no ladder or any of his tools and was about to climb to the next floor when he noticed that the number card was missing from the second floor landing. He made a mental note to get a new one from the workshop and headed up to the 3rd floor. People stole them from time to time, mostly kids, and David was pretty used to replacing them. However, David felt his anger bubbling up when he got to the 3rd floor landing and noticed that the number was gone there, too. David ground his teeth together, finding nothing but more work. Some group of bored kids had come by and stolen his signs, and now he had to get them replaced before management noticed. It would be hard to hang it without a ladder, but he would manage somehow. Thankfully, they hadn't stolen his power drill, so he wouldn't have to work too hard to get them hung again. He climbed to the next floor, and his blistering curses echoed down the stairs behind him. They had stolen this one too. What the hell was going on? When he found the same missing sign on the 5th floor, David decided to give up on this little errand. To hell with his ladder. He apparently had work to do. David had descended back down to what he thought was the 1st floor when he noticed that the door was locked. The stairwell door was never supposed to be locked. It was the building's escape route in case of a fire. As David tried to open the door, he shouted and slammed his shoulder against it. He peeked through the little window set into the door, but the image on the other side just didn't look right. The world beyond was nothing like what he'd expected. It looked like the hospital he'd known, but it was covered in a swirl of smog or smoke or something, and David had feared that there might actually be a fire in progress. He'd picked up his radio and tried to call for help, but the squall from the other side made him pull away quickly. David began to wonder what sort of things were going on, and whether he might be in over his head. He decided to climb to the second floor and try the door, but the second floor was much the same. David was terrified by this point. He didn't understand. If it was a fire, people should be on the stairs, fleeing the building. There should be no reason for the doors not to open. They had no locks to speak of in the first place. There was a key lock that could be engaged if you were painting or there was an emergency on the stairs, but only David and Hector, the day shift supervisor, had keys to that lock. David began to run up the stairs, 2 at a time, trying every door he came to and finding them all locked and inaccessible. At the 5th floor, David comforted himself with the idea that he could just go up to the roof and try to get someone's attention, maybe even climb down the side of the building. When the stairwell led to another floor with another identical door and another set of steps ascending upward, David really began to panic. He rushed up the stairs, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He climbed and climbed, sure that any minute he would see the access door to the roof, sure that he would realize that this had all been some sort of fever dream. But no matter how high he climbed or how fast he ran, he never reached the top of the stairs. David was nearly hyperventilating when he finally sat down and put his back against the wall. It didn't make any sense. The stairs were only 5 stories tall. David walked every step at least 5 times a day. The roof was where he went to smoke, since the admins wouldn't let him do it out in front of the hospital anymore. How many times a day did he go up to the roof to have a cigarette? 5? 10? When the ladder and tools had gone missing, he could have overlooked that as some kind of mistake. This, however, was an affront to his very senses. As David leaned against the wall, the unopened door sitting across from him with its hazy window, he was in for another shock. He was digging in his fanny pack, something he kept snacks in just in case he had a low blood sugar spell. As he peeled the wrapper off the granola bar, he became aware of a prickling on his skin. He could see a strange shadow from the corner of his eye and looked over to the small window that showed him the strange hospital floor beyond the barrier. At first, he thought maybe the lights had gone out over there, but the more his eyes searched, the more he realized that something was blocking out the light that came woozily through the rectangle. Its skin was mottled purple. Its eyes were large and round, filled with little floating spots of blood. Its teeth were fixed in a monstrous, predatory grin. Those spotty eyes were fixed on David, and its regard was something that made his skin crawl. For just a moment, David thought it was screaming at him. When he lunged off the wall and began to run up the stairs, he realized he was the one who was screaming. David couldn't have said how many stairs he ran up, couldn't begin to say how long his panic had caused him to run in a terrified flight, but he was soon pelting upwards at a breakneck speed. When he finally collapsed, the concrete scraping his cheek as he fell, his lungs burned and pumped with the effort to keep up with his galloping heart. He might have been laying there for minutes, days, even just seconds, but when he felt the weight of those terrible eyes looking at him again, David turned his head and saw that a new creature was staring through the little window. It looked like a bat that had fallen into a pincushion, and its skin rippled with sharp spines, even as its 2 intelligent eyes stared at him through the glass. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but his legs would not support him. He lay there transfixed by the sight of this terrible creature as it stared at him. What were its intentions? Could, and the thought scared him more than the sight of the creature, this thing get through the door? It seemed content to stare at him like a visitor in a zoo, but what if its curiosity, or even its hunger, got the better of it? David had thought that his energy was spent. When the overhead light went out, though, leaving him in total darkness save for the thin sliver that came through the rectangular window, he found that his terror and adrenaline gave him a little bit more. He screamed again, the scream tearing out of him like a wound, and he ran towards the light he saw on the landing above him. He kept climbing, seeing the lights disappear below him, and as the darkness chased him up the stairs, David felt he was on the verge of madness. He had to stay in the light. Something told him that it would be very bad if he didn't. and he believed it. When he fell, his foot fumbling on the edge of the step, he screamed as he tumbled back into the blackness. The concrete stairs scraped him up, cutting his skin and rubbing him raw. He fell into the darkness, rolling backwards as momentum took him down onto the landing with the door that would not open. The light spilled across him, making him look like an actor at the end of a play. The light was bright but murky, and it became murkier still as the creatures gathered around the window to look at him. David's head hurt. He had clearly hit it on the way down. As he lay there in that deepening darkness, he almost wished that they would come in and get him. His body was a mass of pain, and his sanity felt like a ball of yarn after a kitten's been at it. As he lay there and contemplated his death, David felt himself slipping off into unconsciousness. He didn't know if he'd ever wake up again, and at that moment, he didn't really care. The next thing I knew, I was coming to on the first floor landing and everything was back to normal, David said. I listened to David's story, my breath catching several times, unsure of what to make of it. In the 3 days he had been missing, 100 people had been up and down those stairs. None of them had reported seeing David. None of them had reported being trapped in the stairwell, and the thought that people had climbed the stairs where David had ran in a blind panic was somehow even more terrifying. Someone on day shift maintenance found his missing ladder and tools in the basement the day before David was to be released. The tools were neatly placed under the ladder, which was folded up and leaned against the boiler. Management assumed that David had misplaced it, but David swore that he hadn't been in the basement for months. Not since I had to check the hot water heater after the pilot light went out, he said, his voice unsure. No one could explain where David had been or what had happened to him, but they all agreed that David would likely be fired if it ever happened again. David doesn't go into the stairwell anymore, not unless he has someone with him. Carl goes with him sometimes if he has to use the stairs, and I've come with him a few times if I was on break or something. Otherwise, David takes the elevator. He's lost his liking for those 150 stairs now, and I can't say as I blame him. It did stop him from smoking, so I guess there was that. The elevator would only go up to the 5th floor, and since no one he knew smoked, David gave up the habit. I guess his smoking was a small price to pay for never having to experience that again. There are places in this old hospital that seem to border on places better left alone. These places seem to hunger for us, to draw us to them, and those who enter are rarely the same again. I met someone new at the hospital tonight. Someone with a very interesting story. Mark came over to watch YouTube videos on his break as I sat behind the reception desk, and he had someone new with him, wearing brown scrubs signaling he was a custodian. Mark said his name was Gerald, and they had struck up a friendship as he cleaned the switchboard office. The two had started talking about spooky stuff. Mark had told him about the calls from the 3rd floor, the phantom phone calls that happened in the wee hours, and Gerald had told him about the strange occurrences he had heard about on the 3rd floor as well. It's not really that scary, but it's pretty weird. I told him I'd love to hear it, and he began. It all started when Maria disappeared. The meeting was just as it was every day. The head custodian giving out assignments, talking about budgets, assigning special teams, before he started down a very different track. He told us the 3rd floor would be cleaned in pairs now, and that no one would be cleaning alone after 8 p.m. There were quite a few raised eyebrows at this. It would take longer to clean if they had to do it in pairs, but the next announcement really got them staring. Management has asked us to remind you that if you hear anyone calling your name from a room you know to be empty, do not respond. Leave the area and inform a member of the custodial team. You will not be disciplined. Management wants to ensure that no one else goes missing on shift. We broke then, going to clean our assigned areas. They were, of course, talking about Maria. Maria had been a custodian at the hospital for several years. She had been working her way through cosmetology school, living with her mother and helping with the bills. Anyone who had worked with Maria knew that she was passionate about her family and her education. She was friendly, but she made it very clear that she didn't have time for boys or needless waste. She worked, she went home, she went to school, and then she repeated the process the next day. She had disappeared one night during her shift, and it was harder to write off as just another young person disappearing with their boyfriend. Staff had been questioned, work schedules had been looked over, cameras had been watched, and Maria remained unfound. The footage showed that Maria had come to work, clocked in at the scanner box, and gone off to the shift meeting. She had taken her cart up to the 3rd floor and began to clean. She cleaned 3 North, the short stay wing, and moved on to 3 South, the longer residency wing. Many of these rooms were empty. COVID had made long-term stay a matter of quarantine, and those people were housed downstairs in the ER overflow. She had gone to lunch at 7:30 and then returned to her duties. At 9, a camera near the nurse's station had seen her turn suddenly and look into room 405. She had stood as though hearing something inside. The mop she had been putting away looked like it might fall out of her hands, and she let it fall from the cart as she took a step towards the room she'd been staring at. She stepped into the room like a sleepwalker and never stepped back out again. That had been a week ago. The announcement about the voices had come after they'd interviewed a few of her friends. They said that she had been nervous lately. She claimed that she hadn't been sleeping well. She told them that she had dreamed about this place. In the dream, she was cleaning the hallways, and from the doors, she could hear voices calling her name. They told her to come investigate, to come look, to come and see, and just as she would catch sight of the speaker, she would come awake, crying. She couldn't remember what had been in those rooms, but it always filled her with a sense of dread. When she started hearing the voices at work, too, she had asked people to come with her. They said she was afraid to be alone, especially on the 3rd floor, where the voices seemed to follow her. She had stopped sleeping at all, her eyes bearing dark circles, and the last day they had seen her at work, she confided that her studies had suffered as well. She was slowly driving herself crazy with these delusions, one of the other housekeepers had said. I think if it had gone on much longer, she would have probably crashed her car on the way to work one morning. Now Maria had gone, and more than one custodian had refused to clean the 3rd floor, something that was about to become a big problem for me. I was cleaning the 1st floor bathrooms when Roger approached me. "Gerald, I need you to move for a while." I looked up from my mop bucket. "Yeah? Who quit?" "Jan. After I told her she'd have to clean the 3rd floor. I need to move you up there to work with Daryl." "Christ! You sure that's why she quit?" I know, but you know how hard it is to fire anyone around here. Look, I just need you to clean up there for a couple of days. A week tops. I'll even give you a couple of days off, with pay, once we replace Jan. What do you say?" I thought it over. 4-day weekend, 2 of them with pay, and all I had to do was clean with Daryl for a few nights. Yeah, I suppose that would be okay. I had already figured that I would be doing most of the cleaning myself, but that wasn't too bad either. Cleaning was monotonous, but it wasn't terribly hard. Half the rooms I'd have to clean were empty anyway, so it would just be a little light upkeep. What was the worst that could happen, right? I took my cart and headed upstairs. When the elevator doors opened, I could already see a cart waiting in what had been the patient's waiting area, and was now just a corridor with benches in it. I could see soda cans on it, 3 or 4 empties, and about 3 others that were waiting to be sacrificed, and knew just whose it was. Daryl's cart was much like Daryl, messy and unconcerned with it. Daryl had about as much business being a custodian as I had being a pigeon, but Roger had been right. They were desperate for help, and Daryl came to work, even if he didn't do anything. I walked over to 3 North and introduced myself, asking what still needed to be cleaned. The charge nurse sniffed. "Everything to my knowledge. I haven't seen Daryl at all. Not that I'm surprised." I sighed. I had hoped that Jan would have at least cleaned 3 North before quitting, but I suppose that was too much to hope for. I set to work with my mop and my cleaners and started cleaning up behind patients and staff. It took forever. Some of the toilets in the patients' rooms looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, and when I finally rolled my cart off the wing, it was after 9. I was thinking longingly about my dinner, but decided to finish 3 South so I could eat and start on 3 East when I got done. As expected, 3 South was a ghost town. The nurse's station was empty, the monitors black, and the whole wing was quiet. I wondered which one of these rooms I'd find Daryl asleep in, and shook my head as I set about dusting the nurse's station. The dust wasn't too thick. It was obvious that the station had either been dusted recently, or the wing had been cleared out recently. The break room was also pretty clean. I only had to clean a few moldy food items out of the fridge and change some garbage. The bathrooms needed cleaning. Clearly Daryl didn't do bathrooms, and once the station was clean, it was time to head to the rooms. As I started cleaning, I kept my ears peeled for sounds. Now, I didn't believe in voices from rooms. Ghosts and spooks were totally something I didn't put a lot of stock in. but I did believe in serial killers, or people who kidnap people to sell them into the human trafficking market. Maria had been a very pretty girl, young and well-built, and the thought that someone had somehow taken her from the hospital wasn't terribly far-fetched. If that was the case, and this was a place they usually used to take their prey, I really didn't want to get grabbed or stabbed next. As I cleaned, though, I did start to think I heard something. At first, I wrote it off as the air conditioner, the ancient old thing making noises and trying to rattle the dust motes free of its guts. The more I cleaned, however, the more the air started to sound like words. I ignored it, thinking it was just Daryl playing tricks, if it wasn't my own mind playing tricks on me. I kept cleaning, stepping into the rooms with the open doors, and dusting the beds and the nightstands. I mopped them, checked the bathrooms, and kept the mop at hand in case I had to defend myself. I felt a little sorry for anyone who tried to jump out and scare me, because they were certainly going to get a mop handle upside the head. I was cleaning one of those rooms when I looked up into the big window behind me and stopped in my tracks. The door to the room behind me was open, the room looking much the same as the one I was cleaning, and someone was standing in the doorway. Someone I would have known anywhere. My mother looked exactly the same as I remembered her. Her dark hair, usually up in a bun on her head, fell around her in a long wave of ebony. She was wearing a light white dress, her bare feet poking out from beneath it. She was standing in the doorway, arms spread wide, inviting me to come to her. Her face was serene, restful, exactly the way I remembered her the last time I'd seen her. It was exactly the way she had looked as her casket lid shut and we put her in the ground. I turned around, but she was gone. I put the mop in the bucket and stuck my head out of the room. I called out, seeing if anyone was near. I'd been cleaning for nearly an hour and still hadn't seen Daryl. I wasn't afraid to clean by myself. I wasn't superstitious, didn't believe in spirits, but not seeing anyone was beginning to become nerve-wracking. When no one called out or challenged me, I got back to work. I closed the door to the room I had just been in, but as I wheeled my cart away, I heard a soft voice from the room across from this one. It was low and inviting, and I couldn't help but think of my mom again. The voice was calling to me, begging me to come to her, and I stopped again to look through the door to that room. She was gone, no one inside the room but the shadowy furniture, but it almost seemed like I could feel someone watching me from inside. She was there, and she wanted me to come to her. As I stood dithering in the hall, a multitude of voices called from the doors that stood open farther up. I recognized all of them. They were the voices of lost loved ones, old friends, and others who had passed on. I heard my great-uncle, my first girlfriend, my third-grade English teacher, and so many more. I heard them calling to me, trying to entice me into their room, to entice me from this world, and I felt my feet pulled towards them as they called. I'd have walked willingly into those rooms, but at that moment, an alarm went off, and I was jarred back to reality. Code blue, room 302. Code blue, room 302. I shook myself. Somewhere on 3 North, there would be people with crash carts in full sprint. Somewhere on 3 North, nurses would be pulling charts and calling doctors. Family members might be yelling or crying, praying to God for their loved ones to come out of this crisis. On 3 South, however, there was only me and the multitude of voices. With the last of my resolve, I ran. I cocked an eyebrow at Gerald. What happened after that? I came to talk to Mark about it. I know he's had some weird experiences in this place, and I was hoping he might have some insight. He brought me down here to talk to you. I shrugged. I can talk to Carl. Maybe he'll go up to the 3rd floor with you when you need to clean. Seeing Carl wander by about that time, I called out to him, and he came somberly over to us. I made my request, and Carl agreed, but said he couldn't tonight. 3rd floor is closed for the moment anyway. We're missing a custodian, and a few of us are being sent to search 3 South. After the girl disappeared last week, this will probably get the wing closed off. As it happens, the wing did close. It was temporarily closed, of course. They'll have patients in there again if the need arises. God help us if one of them goes missing. Staff is one thing, but if their precious patients go missing, they might have to actually do something about it. Gerald went back to his usual cleaning route. We still talk sometimes. He's a good guy, and I don't mind having a cup of coffee with him. We guys who have been privy to the strange happenings of the hospital have to stick together, after all. It was only a matter of time before I had my own experience, I guess. You only get to chronicle things like this for so long before they decide to come and say hi. Yesterday they rolled out the welcome wagon in spectacular fashion. It all started with the laziness of the shift before me. I came in around 6 p.m. to start my shift and noticed a large white envelope at the reception desk. I asked Tyler, the guy who works the day shift, how long that had been sitting there. He shrugged and said they had brought it in around noon. When I asked why he hadn't bothered to get it delivered, he said he had been busy. Given the indent in the chair, I doubted he had left the desk all day. He said his goodbyes and headed out, and I sat down to start my own work for the night. I promptly forgot about the envelope until around midnight, when I got a call that started all of this. The second I heard the oh-so-docer tones of head nurse Finley from 5 East, I knew this wouldn't be a fun conversation. Do you have a legal envelope at your desk? Yeah, day shift left it here and never delivered it. And when were you planning to deliver it? I could almost hear her biting the inside of her cheek as she talked to me. My apologies, ma'am. I'm still waiting to receive a break. When someone comes to relieve me for a few minutes, I'll bring it right up there to you. Those papers are critical, and I needed them at the start of my shift, not 6 hours later. Have someone bring them up to me immediately, or I'll be drafting a complaint to your supervisor. That got my attention. My supervisor, Helen, pretty well left the night shift alone. Day shift, however, was almost constantly subjected to her micromanaging. If I gave her a reason to, I'm sure she'd be happy to add me to her list of things to do. So I turned on my best customer service voice and assured the charge nurse that I would have her envelope there within the hour. She hung up on me, and I looked up to see Carl wandering by about that time. Hey, Carl, you got a minute to take this up to 5 East? Sorry, man, Carl said. I'm on a tight schedule tonight. I need to get up to 3 North before 3 o'clock and handle some kind of lock malfunction for them. Okay, well, could you stand here for 5 minutes while I do it? I'll be right up and down. Won't take me more than a couple of minutes. That got Carl's attention. You could tell the poor guy had been running his legs off all night. Hospital security never seemed to stop after 8 o'clock, and the thought of taking it easy for 5 to 10 minutes appealed to him. He nodded, telling me to go ahead as he took a load off, and I grabbed the envelope and headed for the elevators. The elevators in the lobby are brand new. They don't hitch, they don't shake, and they can generally be counted on to take you from the ground floor to the 5th floor without smelling like burning rubber bands or threatening to drop you to your death. They were installed about 5 years ago with some budget money from the state, and they're a vast improvement on the ones that we had before. Or so I've been told. They're well maintained, too. All the lights work, the handrails are clean, and when you push the buttons, they light up, letting you know exactly where they're taking you. I walked past these and turned down a nearby corridor to find the staff elevators. If you've never worked in a hospital, you might not be aware of this. The administration doesn't like it when staff use the guest elevators. It leads guests to ask them questions that some of them are more than happy to answer, whether they should or not. It also leads staff to push patients in gurneys onto elevators, which sometimes frightens the guests. This is, of course, gone over very carefully in our yearly training, so we all know not to use the nice new guest elevators. The staff elevators are not as nice. The lights flicker, they smell like they're constantly about to break, and they're notorious for getting stuck between floors. According to maintenance, they hadn't sized the elevator shafts right when they built the 4th and 5th floor. This leads to some problems sometimes, and Mark says that not a week goes by when he doesn't get at least one call to the switchboard about someone being stuck in the elevators. In fact, he had a hilarious story about a doctor who cried on the emergency phone for close to 3 hours while he was stuck inside one of those elevators. He said the poor guy was talking about things with claws, disembodied laughing, and weird noises coming from inside and outside the elevator. Mark always laughed it off as weird, frightening paranoia, and until today, I'd laughed right along with him. The trip up in the staff elevators was uneventful. The wheels chugged, the lights flickered a little when they passed 3 and 4, but when they dinged drunkenly to let me out on the 5th floor, only a minute and a half had passed. I walked around the corner to 5 North, and it seemed that luck was with me. The charge nurse was just stepping into the back to get a cup of coffee, and I handed the envelope to one of her subordinates as I asked if she would mind passing it off to her. She smiled and said that she would, advising that I get moving before the old battle axe returned and found me here. I climbed happily back into the staff elevator, thinking I had dodged a bullet. When I hit the big red button on the elevator, I thought nothing more exciting than a ride down was about to happen. I had no idea what was in store for me. When the elevator ground to a halt between floor 3 and 4, I loosed a growling cry of rage. In frustration, I smashed at the buttons, but the box did little but click and grind as it stuck tight in the shaft. I was going to have to call Mark so David could come get me unstuck. I picked up the emergency phone inside the little box at the bottom of the button pad and expected to hear it click as it rang in the control room. Instead, it just hung there, silently. I hung it back up and picked it back up again, expecting a delay in the line, but there was still silence. I figured I'd disconnected the line when the elevator got stuck, and when I hung the phone back up, I thought guiltily about how Carl would be a little late for his checks. Without the ability to let anyone know, I could be stuck here for quite some time. I paced around the elevator like a mouse stuck in a shoebox. I hated confined places. I wasn't claustrophobic, but I hated the feeling of being stuck. The little box felt like a coffin the longer I sat in it, and looking at my watch didn't help matters. At some point, it had stopped, and I hadn't noticed. It informed me that only about 4 minutes had passed since I left the desk. But that couldn't be right. I'd been stuck in this elevator longer than that. I tried the phone again, but it was still dead, and I hung it up a little harder than I strictly needed to. As I sat in the corner of the elevator, feeling the cold metal against my back, it sounded like something was tapping against the outside. Well, of course, I could hear tapping, I told myself. The elevator was sitting in a chute, probably trying to get itself to work again. If nothing else, it was ticking as it got comfortable in the slightly too small chute. It sounded different than that, though. This sounded different than the ticking of an elevator getting comfortable, and more like the tapping of fingers on glass. I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself I was being silly, but as I leaned my head back against the metal box, the tapping became harder and harder to ignore. It was almost rhythmic. 2 beats, 3 beats, 2 beats again, on the outside of the metal box. It reminded me of someone just absent-mindedly tapping on their desk, maybe working out a beat in their head as they put words to it. It had no real rhythm, and the longer I listened to it, the less sure I was that it was normal elevator noise. Was somebody out there? They couldn't be, could they? That was why the elevator got stuck, after all. The space was too small. I'd been thinking too loudly about it, and missed the point where the tapping had stopped. I sat in a pregnant silence for a count of 30, cocking my head as I listened and waited for the tapping to begin again. When the elevator suddenly shook like it had been kicked by a horse, I felt like I might need a new pair of pants when all this was over. I tried to get a hold of myself. It was just maintenance, working on the elevator after all. Someone had noticed that the elevator wasn't working, and they were trying to get it running again. I was sure that David was in the motor room, trying to figure out how much pressure to put on the winch to get the cart to move without ripping it to shreds. He told me one night that it was basically all he could do, just exert a little more force on the winch and hope that he didn't pulp some poor staffer. OSHA would likely have a field day with it, but I'm just doing what maintenance told me to do, he had said. When it lurched again, I breathed a sigh of relief when it started to go down. I grabbed the rails, however, as the feeling of gravity left the car. I was suddenly plummeting down like a comet. The buttons flashed, dinging a hellish chorus as I shook and clung to the wall. As I fell, I watched the numbers tick down until they were finally just spinning in place, indecipherable jargon that meant nothing. When the screeching returned, I no longer had any illusions that it was just the box grinding against the walls. The doors began to rock, and the lights overhead flashed like a funhouse ride. Something began to peel the doors open, its long black claws making the steel slab groan in agony. As it slid open, I could see something huge push its head into the space. It had a face like a dragon, its eyes burning as it stared at me through the gap. Behind it, I could see that I was falling through a red and black hellscape. The skies cried fire as the ground came up to swallow me, but I didn't think smashing into the earth was the worst outcome in this case. As it opened its mouth, I saw fire kindle in its throat. The bloom of red began to grow, and I could feel the heat as it built in that small place. I covered my face with my arms, praying for any protection from my frail body that it could grant. Then the cheery ding filled the car, and I was looking at the dim illumination from the staff hallway by night. A woman was stepping in, a cup of coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, and she stopped as she saw me. She looked confused, asking if I was okay, but as the doors began to close, I shot through them like a lunatic and went running from the elevator like the devil himself was chasing me. Carl smiled and commented that I'd only been gone about 5 minutes and must have made pretty good time. His face fell when he got a good look at me, and he turned white as I told him what had happened. "Maybe David really did see something in the stairwell," he whispered, and all I could do was nod somberly. I sat there for the rest of my shift, but I didn't get any work done. I haven't slept well in 3 days. My nightmares plagued by the images I saw in that elevator. I've stumbled onto the hospital's radar, and as little as I want to find out what it has in store for me, I'll be back tomorrow night for more. The money's nice, but what I really crave is the tales that come from the lips of the recently terrified. There may be a book somewhere in these stories. My suffering and the suffering of others should be worth something, after all.